Welcome to the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast from Never Too Late Cafe. I'm your host, Laura Womack. Each week, we sit down for a chat with someone just like you, someone who had an idea, a passion, a dream, or sometimes just a thought, and planted that seed, watched it grow into something they wanted to share with the world. If you have an idea for a topic or someone that would be a guest for the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook, where you can join our Never Too Late Cafe Facebook group. We'd love to hear from you. I have a very special guest with me today, Rick Swanson from Minnesota.
That's correct. I'm from Rochester, Minnesota.
Well, welcome. Is that where you're from originally?
Yes, I'm a Minnesotan born and bred, and outside of a short stint when I was a toddler living in Fargo, North Dakota. I've lived in Minnesota all my life.
Wow. So do you say hey up there, A?
Yes, you might hear that. Minnesotans have kind of an exaggerated dialect, I suppose, largely embodied in the movie Fargo. And when that came out, Minnesotans took great offense and they sneered and said, well, we don't talk like that. But I had to tell them and remind them, yes, we actually do.
Well, let's just jump right into your story. And so tell us a little bit about your photography and how that got started.
Well, I first picked up a 35 millimeter film camera in 1974 when I took a summer school photography class as a junior high student. And prior to that, I suppose I had one of those Kodak Instamatic cameras with the square flash bulbs, if any listeners remember those types of cameras. But it was holding it was holding a 35 millimeter camera in my hand, which really caught my attention. And I didn't have one of my own until 1979 when I graduated from high school, and I used my high school graduation money to buy my first 35 millimeter camera. And it's a camera I still own and still use all these years later. Wow. But nothing formal with photography back then. It's just I enjoyed the hobby of taking pictures. And I kind of left it behind for a period of years while I was raising kids and whatever else. And then picked it up again sometime after film cameras had gone out of style and digital cameras were the norm. So I did start dabbling in digital photography and acquired my first decent digital camera. But I couldn't get film out of my mind. And so even though it's harder to acquire film these days, you can still find black and white film, especially online. And so that's also what I spend a good portion of my time shooting is black and white film. And I like it because it slows me down, and with digital cameras, you can snap 1,000 pictures with hardly blinking, and you throw away 95% of them and just keep the few that you like. And with film, you have to be a little more judicious and slow down and compose your image in the viewfinder a little more carefully because no one wants to burn through film at that pace. And especially now that it's more expensive than it ever used to be. So, but I like it. I like the feel of that bulky camera in my hand, and I like the sound that the camera makes when I'm advancing the film. It makes that characteristic clackety clack sound, and I like hearing the shutter snap and all of that. It's just kind of a full sensory experience. And now that I'm shooting my own film, again, it's harder to find places to develop it. So I went back to my 8th grade summer school experience and retaught myself how to develop film. And so I do that myself now at home. And I use coffee as the film developing fluid. So it turns out coffee can develop film. And so I think I'm the only person in Rochester doing that. There are plenty of people across the United States and in Europe who use coffee as a film developer.
Is it the acid?
That's what everybody wants to believe, but acid actually would inhibit the development of the film. So you have to add some other ingredients to the coffee to
Oh,
neutralize the acid in the coffee. No, it's actually the tannins in coffee, much like red wine has tannins. It's the tannins in the brewed coffee that act upon the silver that's in the film that give you your image when it's all done.
so I envision like a basement with strings and pictures hanging. Is that what you do?
Well, I'm not quite like that. So, that image that you're conjuring up is for the person who actually goes further than I do and develops the final prints as well. So I don't have a full darkroom set up for doing print developing. I just do the development of the film itself. And once it is developed, then I scan it with a digital scanner and work digitally from there. But that image that I can picture what you have in your mind, that would be, I'm almost like that because I'll have strings of negatives hanging
Okay.
from the ceiling, but don't have
Oh,
strings of prints developed.
I think I still have some pictures with negatives. And I'm like, how did we ever see them? How did we ever see them? But
Well, and
uh,
they take up physical space too, and so I've got sheets upon sheets of film negatives just from shooting in the last few years with my black and white pursuits. And so, right, it's a consideration is you have to have a place to store all of this stuff. It's a lot less convenient than just storing digital images on a hard drive somewhere.
um, well, I know that sounds you've got some really interesting pictures I've seen on your site. And so you describe yourself as doing art photography.
Right. As opposed to someone who's a wedding photographer or a portrait photographer. So
Okay.
I've chosen to stay out of that game. I don't need the stress of working with an anxious bride to capture her special day.
Yeah.
And I also probably don't have the patience to work with babies to do, newborn photographs or high school seniors, I suppose. So
Yeah.
um, now I'm a bit of a liar. I have, in fact, shot a wedding or two, but that's usually for a family or a friend. So, but as a business, no, I don't do portrait photography of that type. My goal is to get my photographs hanging on your wall or in your office. And so I shoot things that I think would appear well as an art photograph as opposed to being a portrait photographer.
Mm. I noticed one of your pictures. I really want to ask you how you did it, actually. It's a pepper, like a vegetable pepper, and it's a kaleidoscope. Like,
Yeah, no, I I'm not much of a gardener, but I try to put a garden in each year. And in Minnesota, here we are in the third week of May, and it's still a bit early to try to put in your garden. So you have to take into account that we have a very short growing season here.
oh,
But one of the few things I can manage to grow, it seems, are peppers of various kinds. And and I'm delighted with how colorful they turn out to be. And so one of the pictures that you might have seen is one where I made kind of a rainbow um, layout of various peppers that came out of my garden, and I arranged them in a semicircle. And I don't know if that's the one that you saw,
it was
but
definitely a kaleidoscope look to
more of
it.
a kaleidoscope image. Okay. Well, when I do that, that's starting with a colorful image that captures my fancy. And then I do manipulation with Photoshop, creating what is called layers of images, and then stacking those layers on top of each other digitally, so to speak, to create that kaleidoscopic effect. And so if you take an image and you rotate it, it would have to be 60 degrees, I suppose, and lay that image on top of the first one. Now the images intersect a little bit, and then if you rotate the next 60 degrees and so on, you can build a six-sided kaleidoscopic figure. And if you change the angle, then you can maybe get an eight-sided or a 10-sided kaleidoscopic figure. But yeah, I have fun doing that just to see how the images come out, because you can't really tell with the base image how it's going to look after you've layered it multiple times on top of itself. But it's a fun digital technique that I use to create those kaleidoscopes.
It's a very interesting picture, I can tell you that. So, and there's one of your pictures I wanted you to describe. It was outside the realm of possibility.
Well, thank you for bringing that one up. That's actually one of my personal favorite images from my black and white collection. And that appeared in my very first solo art show that I held here in Rochester, where I received a local arts grant to explore this coffee developing process a little further, and then also develop a full series of images to put into my capstone project, my final show. And I called that show Light Chasers. And photographers and painters will describe themselves as light chasers because light is such a crucial element for the painter in the way not only they see the subject they're painting, but also in the way they apply their paints. So the ability to use paint to create sense of light and shadow and so on. Painters describe themselves as light chasers. I, as a photographer, also describe myself as a light chaser because I'm literally trying to put light into my camera. And so again, chasing sunsets or just chasing the right illumination of a subject for my camera describes me as an artist. The spin I put on it for this exhibit was that by background, I'm a chemist and a student of the history of science and chemistry and physics in particular. And I spent a fair amount of time in graduate school studying the history of the discovery of the electron and also its relationship to our understanding of the nature of light. And if you look over the past few hundred years of scientific thought around light, our ideas about light have changed immensely. We've understood light to be kind of a ray sort of a thing. And then there was a period of time when we thought light was more of a particle type model. And then we got into a wave sort of a model. And now there's this hybrid notion that depending on what you're looking for, light either behaves as a wave or a particle, and that's pretty bizarre. And so I wove my interest in studying the history of our understanding of light and treated those physicists also as light chasers. So that brings us to the image that you mentioned out of the realm of probability. There's a public sculpture here in Rochester, and if any of the listeners have been to Chicago and are familiar with the bean, the so-called bean sculpture, that big stainless steel sculpture in Chicago, we have our own kind of version of a bean which is not bean shaped, but it's that same shiny stainless steel, and it sits out in front of our Civic Center here in Rochester. And the piece is untitled, but to describe it to you, you'll have to try to imagine a stylized three-dimensional version of the Nike swoosh, I suppose. And it's kind of a swooshy shaped stainless steel sculpture. And so I took a picture of that and standing in such a way that I could look under the swoosh. The swoosh is shaped kind of like a big arc through the air. And I was using my film camera, so I was taking a black and white image, and it was February, roughly, I want to say. And there happened to be a pedestrian walking and visible as I looked underneath the swoosh. And I caught the pedestrian walking in the crosswalk just as they passed underneath the sculpture. Okay, what does that all have to do with the title of the piece? That swoosh shape reminded me of what I learned in my science classes and studied in the history of science, of what has come to be called an orbital. And an orbital, I'll try to make it in simplest terms as I can. An orbital is a region of space in the atom where you're most likely to find an electron. And they are mathematical principles, basically, but people have tried to visualize them by graphing out this probability onto a graph so that the rest of us mere mortals can sort of have some sense of what the mathematicians and physicists are talking about. And some of those probabilities map out into a shape that kind of looks like our swoosh sculpture. And the idea would be that under certain energy conditions, the electron in an atom is likely to inhabit the region of space described by the swoosh. And it's unlikely that in that energy condition, you would find an electron outside of that region described by the swoosh. So here I am photographing this pedestrian as he crosses under the sculpture, and he's clearly not in the region described by the swoosh, right? And so he's outside of the realm of probability. He's he's not in the likely region described by the swoosh, but he's outside of that. And so that's where that title came from. It was a highly extrapolated interpretation of orbital physics and combined with my vision of black and white photography. So a long explanation to a short question, but that's where that came from.
I have come to learn that the way someone titles their art is very personal. And so sometimes it's just something I've had friends say, oh, it's just something that pops in my head. And then sometimes it's a whole theory, just as you described. And it's all, again, very personal.
Yeah, and in that show, each of the black and white images that I created was linked to some historical topic in science that I recalled from my graduate studies. So that's where that one came from.
So going back to your education, talk a little bit about your science and some of that, because that's really interesting. How did you get interested in going into science or studying science?
Well, I was from a generation of people who were going to high school in the 70s, and many of us had career counselors back then. And so we did these career interest inventories, right? And so my career interest inventory that I took in high school had me out in the far extreme corner of the grid, where it said I should be a laboratory chemist.
Mm.
And apparently I was nerdy, introverted, and all things which are still true, actually, by the way. And so they pegged me as a laboratory chemist as a career to pursue. Now it turned out that I liked high school chemistry. I had a very likable chemistry teacher, and I'd come into class and he called me Swanee. That was my nickname, Swanee. And he'd say, "Hey, Swanee, you're looking like $1,000,000." And he'd greet me that way just about every day. And he wrote a very nice letter to my parents after my year of chemistry in high school, saying how much he enjoyed me as a student. It was just a very nice gesture, right? So I went off to college and I picked chemistry as my major, and I enjoyed it, and it seemed to come reasonably naturally to me. And I struggled a bit by my senior year, and I wasn't sure I was going to fulfill the dream by that stage, but my professors apparently took pity on me, and I did pass my final semester and completed my chemistry degree. And so I took a position as a chemist, and with a small chemical manufacturer in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it was enjoyable to the extent that I needed it to be, I guess. And but they called on me when guests would come, guests of the business would come. They called on me to give the laboratory tour. And so I would do that. I would take the guests around and describe the different research we were engaging in and that sort of thing. And it ultimately became clear to me that even though I was fulfilling the prognostications of the high school career inventory that I had taken years earlier, it became clear to me that I was not destined to be a laboratory chemist much longer. So when doing a bit of soul searching about what career I should pursue, I thought for the first time about teaching. And based on this experience of giving laboratory tours at the little company I work for. So I went back to school and got a teaching license in the sciences. And that began my education career as a high school and middle school chemistry and physics teacher.
Physics too. Wow.
Physics too. So, I get a lot of people who say, "Oh, I did terrible in chemistry. I couldn't keep up." But I really loved physics. That was fun. And then I get other people, especially when I was teaching, and we would have parents' night, early in the year. The parents would come in to my physics classroom, and they just would get all wide-eyed and say, "Oh, this brings back bad memories." And I loved chemistry, but I couldn't stand, so everybody had their own. Some loved chemistry, some loved physics, but yes, I taught both. And some of the most fun I had, I think, was teaching high school physics.
Well, that's interesting. Those were neither one topics that I enjoyed in school. I just remember.
Well, you didn't have me for a teacher, Laura.
So. No. And I remember even like there was chemistry and biology, they were kind of the track at one point. Yeah, haunting memories, just put it that way.
Right.
There were a picture I wanted to ask you about too before I forget.
Yeah.
There was one about a bee, and it was, I don't know if the bee is, you're showing a hive. It was a collaboration of sorts.
Oh, sure. That's a recent collaboration. So I don't know if this is a common thing throughout the country, but Here, at least in Minnesota, there is some effort among uh, bee protagonists, beekeepers, honey producers, to be as protective as possible for the bees.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we're in the midst of a no mow May campaign that seems to crop up annually. And there's some back and forth about whether that's a good idea for the bees or not to do any mowing in the entire month of May. But in Minnesota, again, we have such a short growing season that when the bees kind of wake up from their winter slumber, it takes them a while to get going because the temperatures are still cool here.
Mm.
But our plants haven't started flowering yet. And so there's not a lot of food for them as they wake up. And so um, a plant that I was socialized to despise, the humble dandelion,
Mm.
is one of the first things to flower in our yards here, much to the chagrin of those who would rather have their yard look more like a golf course than a flower garden. But the No Mow May campaign is to try to discourage people from mowing down even dandelions so that the bees, as they wake up from their winter slumber, have at least something to try to nourish themselves on. So anyway, my friend Chris, who is a beekeeper and honey producer, operates a company called the Bee Shed. He had a picture that he took of a bee on a honeycomb. And it's a full color picture, but he had this vision that he wanted much of the picture to be black and white in nature, except for kind of a ziggy zaggy trail of cells in the honeycomb, which would retain the color. And he didn't know how to pull that off. And he knew I messed around with Photoshop and things like that. So he asked if I could take his original image of the bee on the honeycomb and do that removal of color except for the ziggy zaggy path. And so I did that, and then he wanted to use that image in a blog that he has on his website um, to again promote good stewardship of the land and taking care of our pollinators. He makes an interesting case in his blog that we pat ourselves on the back for not mowing our lawns, some of us in the month of May. But he said we are missing a bigger problem, which is we're still spraying insecticides and pesticides on our lawns and in our gardens, and that's doing even worse harm to the bees.
Mm.
So in his blog article in which he uses this image that I helped edit for him, he makes a stronger case that no mow May might be good, but it isn't nearly enough. We have to take a no spray attitude in our lawns and gardens if we really want to start making a healthier environment for the bees. So I asked him if he was willing to let me promote that image on my website to help get discussion going about no spray and no mow May, and he was open to that. He said, I'll make the honey, you do the photography." So that's our partnership, and that's one of the images that we're currently promoting. He and I will both have our own respective tents at our first big outdoor art gathering here in Rochester, which is tomorrow. And
Oh,
he'll be selling honey and promoting that photograph. And my wife and I will have our art booth set up at the same art fair, and I'll have that same picture. And we'll try to get him some honey customers, and he'll try to get me some photography customers.
so as we're speaking right now, it is May 19th, 2023. Because, on the internet, things, they live a long time. So when someone looks back and you say tomorrow,
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. May 20th is this art fair, and again, for us and other parts of the country, what do you mean that's your first art fair? How can that be? Well, again, it's cold here in Minnesota, so we've been waiting for the weather to warm up enough to start our outdoor art fair season, and kind of the first big one happens to be here in the third week of May.
You seem very community minded. It seems like that's part of your mission. Is that correct? Inclusive and.
Yeah, my wife and I have made that conscious choice about our photography business and how we relate in the world. Our tagline as our primary mission is to promote the common good through art. And so how can we do that? So it's possibly, with we're a very small business. Let's just come out and say that. A hobby business in terms of scale right now. But, we look for activities that we can support with our art, and causes that we can advocate for. So that's why I'm happy to collaborate with my friend Chris on the bee health and good environmental practices, that sort of thing. So yes, that's certainly an intentional position that we have taken with our art business.